Al-Qaeda has already used hijacked airliners as well as car bombs to attack America. Now there's word of a new threat, this time from the sea. Unknown to most Americans, Al-Qaeda has slowly been amassing a fleet of ships to attack America's vulnerable coastline and ports.
It's not if, but when and where and with what impact.
Terrorism experts worry that Al-Qaeda could use its ships to carry weapons of mass destruction or turn one of them into a massive bomb. They could also pack explosives into one of the millions of shipping containers that enter the U.S. every year.
Any container could potentially be used to smuggle or conceal any kind of terrorist weapon.
With pinpoint accuracy, a weapon can be delivered to anywhere in the United States or Europe or anywhere else in the world.
Among the tens of thousands of merchant ships plying the world's oceans are 15 to 20 freighters owned by Osama bin Laden. Security analysts say that with these ships, Al-Qaeda can target the soft underbelly of the United States, its underprotected coastline and ports.
There are 39,100 officers in NYPD, and they're responsible for covering an area of, let's say, 320 square miles in New York City. Well, the Coast Guard is actually the same size as the NYPD. They're about 40,000 people. And they're covering 95,000 miles of coastline. They're covering 361 ports, and they're also responsible for inland waterways.
If I were to rate our security in seaports on a scale of 1 to 10 today, I would give it between a 1 and a 2.
The biggest fear is that Al-Qaeda would use its navy to bring a weapon of mass destruction right up to the edge of a city. It could be a biological weapon sprayed from a seemingly innocuous boat in a city's harbor. Thousands of people could fall ill before anyone realized they were under attack.
A weapon of mass destruction released in, say, the port of Boston or the port of Los Angeles could have serious ramifications to public health and to public security. It's very populous areas, and we are holding our breath, hoping, praying that nothing like that would happen.
Or, worst case scenario, the boat could be carrying a dirty bomb, a crude, relatively small radioactive device.
We know that this guy has attempted to get either a nuclear device or weapons-grade material. We know he's had contacts with some Pakistani nuclear scientists and that sort of thing. So we know he's been interested in it.
If they got their hands on weapons of mass destruction, I don't think there's any doubt that they would use it. They would find a way to bring it into this country and detonate it in a port and make that port uninhabitable if it's a dirty bomb for 100 plus years.
If Osama bin Laden managed to get a dirty bomb, analysts say, his navy could deliver it to the heart of New York or San Francisco.
They can use a boat, even a speedboat, as a poor man's weapon of mass destruction.
Osama bin Laden began amassing his fleet in the mid-1990s. He was reportedly able to buy the vessels from a Greek shipping magnate with ties to the terrorist organization. It's assumed that bin Laden bought ordinary-looking freighters, but the reality is no one knows much about Al-Qaeda's navy. Terrorism specialists don't even know the name Al-Qaeda uses for its fleet or how many ships the terrorists own.
You have estimates all the way between 15 to 300, so you can see the wide gap there.
The numbers vary wildly. It's safe to say that there are vessels out there that have been operated and implicated in operations involving Al-Qaeda.
Some experts, however, are willing to speculate about the makeup of the Navy.
The types of vessels that they would want to primarily use are fast vessels that have enough tonnage capability to move people and objects sufficient to make it worth the risk. Very fast vessels like cigarette racing boats aren't very effective at moving enough people, say a whole terrorist cell, into another nation. A larger ship ends up causing way too much attention to be brought upon it. So you can make some assumptions that Al-Qaeda is going to be using moderately sized cargo vessels, trawlers that could carry anywhere from 5 to 15 personnel in addition to the crew, and sufficient space for cargo for explosives or other devices.
Nevertheless, there are a host of unanswered questions that plague security experts.
You ask about
What assets does Al-Qaeda have? How many agents do they have? How many ships do they have? These are great questions, and I'm not sure we have great answers for them.
Undoubtedly, Al-Qaeda employs different types of vessels for different purposes.
I think you'll see it running the gamut. They'll use small speedboats for tactical purposes. They'll use large commercial ships to move goods and resources.
The larger ships are known to have carried innocuous cargo like sesame seeds and concrete.
Is it a surprise that Al-Qaeda or bin Laden himself is in the shipping business, basically? Not at all. For one thing, it's a good way to make money.
Osama bin Laden has modeled his fleet on the Tamil Tigers, a revolutionary group fighting the government of Sri Lanka. Since the mid-1980s, they have run a navy called the Sea Tigers.
They have logistical vessels, they have small attack craft. They also have available to them an entire fleet of commercial ships.
They use it to procure weapons, to move goods, resources, also generate finances. Al-Qaeda and its associate groups have taken notes and have understood and learned what that capability can do.
The Sea Tigers found that it was easy to form a revolutionary navy because there's no regulatory agency that tracks their operations. The sea is a region of its own, not governed by one country or police force. That makes it ideal for terrorists.
There's a perfect fit between an Al-Qaeda type operation, stateless, masked, very difficult to identify, moving around the world, a match between an outfit like Al-Qaeda, a man like bin Laden, and the maritime business.
It's a world where even legitimate ship owners hide behind shell companies to avoid taxes and regulations.
It's an environment that allows these guys to hide in plain sight, so to speak, and not necessarily break the law in terms of how they hide themselves.
Ships are often licensed under so-called flags of convenience, registries set up without regulations by countries all over the world.
The largest maritime nation on earth is Panama. The second largest maritime nation on earth is a country which practically does not exist, and that's called Liberia. Okay? Mongolia, a landlocked nation, is a maritime nation. Bolivia is a maritime nation.
Recently, the Comoros Islands announced that they would be the first Islamic country to offer a flag of convenience. We shouldn't jump to conclusions that Al-Qaeda will take advantage of such a flag of convenience. It's still a very real possibility.
And if someone gets suspicious about a certain ship, it's simple to change registries quickly, even over the internet.
You could probably pull in with a vessel, change its name, paint the name on while you're at sea, and have all the paperwork downloaded through the internet by satellite and have it printed out and ready for the port authorities. You move to the next port, you could change it all over again and do the same thing.
Terrorists can use these legal loopholes to avoid prying eyes. Authorities point to the example of the Baltic Sky, which was seized off the coast of Greece in 2003.
And it was determined that it had over 800 tons of explosives on board. And the paperwork showed that it was an export-import company that owned it, and it turned out that it was a front company and the whole thing was a facade.
That system becomes a real problem when it gets infiltrated by people intent on causing us massive harm through catastrophic terrorist attacks.
Right now, it appears Al-Qaeda has been using its navy to run drugs from Afghanistan. At the end of 2003, the U.S. Navy stopped 4 dhows in the Arabian Sea carrying 3 tons of heroin, hashish, and methamphetamines, as well as 10 men they said were Al-Qaeda operatives. Experts say it's only natural that Al-Qaeda is looking for new sources of income.
With the advent of the measures that the United States and other countries have taken against the funding of Al-Qaeda, their sources of income, they've had to resort to more criminal enterprises, such as the drug trade.
And the drug running business is a perfect model for Al-Qaeda's navy.
They all end up using the same kinds of tactics. Moving at night, no lights, false registrations, false names, sometimes running false running lights so they look like a fishing vessel, putting up rigging that gives them a different appearance. These are all techniques used by smugglers. They're just as effective if you're a terrorist.
In addition to running drugs, bin Laden can use the ships to move Al-Qaeda terrorists or weapons from country to country. U.S. law enforcement agencies believe at least one ship from Al-Qaeda's navy carried the explosives used in the 1998 bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania.
Wahid al-Hajj, Osama bin Laden's secretary, bought and managed a vessel, the Sky One, and in the late 90s, and actually that vessel was implicated in transporting explosives for purposes of the embassy bombings there.
Experts worry that that's just one of the many ways al-Qaeda's Navy can be used to attack the West.
We know al-Qaeda has operated in the maritime domain. That alone should be cause for concern. Primarily, they use ships now to make money. What's the difference between doing that, taking a ship and ramming it into a bridge or ramming it into a tanker? And the answer is not much.
Osama bin Laden has already used his Navy to attack the U.S. There are signs he may be poised to do it again, with much more catastrophic results. The operatives of al-Qaeda's Navy have already pulled off 2 successful attacks at sea. In October 2000, al-Qaeda terrorists filled a motorboat called a Zodiac with explosives and rammed it into the USS Cole at port in Yemen. It ripped a 40-foot hole in the hull of the warship, killing 17 U.S. sailors and causing more than $100 million in damages.
It knocked out a U.S. destroyer. There's quite a lot of symbolism in that. It killed U.S. servicemen. It caused millions of dollars of damage to the vessel.
2 years later, another Zodiac filled with explosives crashed into the side of the MV Limburg, a French oil tanker, as it headed into Yemeni waters. 1 crew member was killed, and 90,000 gallons of crude oil spilled along the coastline. That attack alarmed experts even more.
We now know that on the attack of the Limburg, al-Qaeda actually had intelligence that they were gleaning either from people working on the inside at the shipping company or at the port that the vessel had just left from. And that kind of encapsulates, I think, the danger of al-Qaeda because they are so detail-driven.
Many experts say the Limburg attack also showed al-Qaeda has shifted its focus from military to economic targets.
They know that the U.S., the British, the French, all the major countries are going to have now watchstanders looking lights and all kinds of different barriers, and they're going to be very, very protective. So what they've decided to do, just like they have with their land targets, is to shift to soft targets. And they're also getting a little bit smarter. They've shifted to economic impact scenarios.
Still, al-Qaeda continues to look for maximum impact and maximum damage. For example, if al-Qaeda terrorists used one of the larger boats in their navy for a suicide attack, the results could be far more deadly. U.S. officials know they've thought about it. In fact, there was another 9/11 plot that was scuttled at the last minute. Al-Qaeda bought a freighter with a crane which carried several small boats called ribs.
The plan was to sail into the Strait of Hormuz, to unload the ribs, and the ribs would have been laden with explosives and would work as a multiple point attack on a passing naval warship or other targets. And then the freighter itself was actually to be rigged with explosives and to sail as close as possible to the target and self-detonate, taking everyone out.
If al-Qaeda had gone through with the attack, the freighter would have been the biggest bomb ever built. That plot and the Cole and Limburg bombings were all believed to have been planned by one man, Abdul Rahim al-Nashadi, al-Qaeda's director of maritime operations. 1 month after the Limburg attack, in November 2002, the U.S. and its allies scored a coup when they caught Nashari in the United Arab Emirates. Officials also recovered a notebook detailing al-Qaeda's maritime strategy.
In his notebook were plans for conducting attacks against U.S. and coalition warships using remote-controlled boats, subsurface swimmers, and hijacked aircraft.
They actually listed the 4 techniques that they wanted everybody to kind of focus on. The first was ramming with a large ship. The second one was using a ship with explosives. The third was using some kind of aviation. The fourth one was underwater, scuba, actually using trained divers and mini submarines to go in and either plant heavy explosives or use the divers or that mini submarine as a weapon in and of itself, loaded with explosives to detonate on impact.
Officials take the underwater threat very seriously because they've also heard about it from other al-Qaeda terrorists. Omar al-Farouk, Al-Qaeda's former head of operations in Southeast Asia, was arrested in Indonesia in June 2002. He told U.S. interrogators that he had planned scuba attacks on U.S. warships in port there.
As far as underwater capability goes, there have been numerous reports on experimentation with scuba and scuba training.
Although Al-Qaeda's Navy operates primarily in the Middle East and North Africa, there is some evidence that its members may have been working with Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terrorist organization, and other groups in South America.
This is the tri-border area between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, and it's kind of a lawless no man's land. This is an area that also has a large ethnic population from the Middle East, and we are aware of individuals from both Hezbollah and other groups that may be aligned with Al-Qaeda who have met there.
That worries American officials because they know that even small freighters like those in Al-Qaeda's Navy could reach U.S. waters from that region.
It's harder for a boat of that size to make a trip across the Pacific or the Atlantic, although it can happen, particularly hitting us from the south, from, let's say, the Gulf of Mexico or Central America, even off the shores of Cuba or Haiti.
If they reached our waters, there is a wide variety of targets and damage those ships could do. Experts are worried that terrorists from Al-Qaeda's Navy could take over a cruise ship loaded with American passengers, like the Achille Laurel hijacking in 1985. Or they could ram a smaller boat into a cruise ship, just as they did with the Cole and Limburg.
The danger to a ship full of people is nothing to be overlooked. We've all seen the results of what Al-Qaeda is willing to do in terms of hurting people, in terms of killing innocent people. Imagine that on a larger scale. That's the threat. That's what we're afraid of.
But other experts think there are more likely targets for Al-Qaeda's Navy.
I think cruise liners are obviously an attractive target, white gleaming objects of capitalism, but beyond that they don't have economic ramifications, and if the groups are really focused on creating severe economic ramifications on a global scale, then they're going to want to attack oil tankers.
If suicide bombers should come alongside an oil tanker in one of our ports and explode a conventional device or a dirty bomb, not only would we have the scare of that in our ports, but we'd have a tremendous oil spill, which could be devastating in terms of not only the ecology, but the economy as well.
Or there may be a totally different plot in the works.
They're really at the beginning of experimenting in the maritime domain, and they had plans to escalate and expand further.
We have no specific threats that we're aware of in terms of what Al-Qaeda or another terrorist organization might hope to do. We can only guess.
There are many scenarios for a maritime attack that haunt terrorism officials. The U.S. has uncovered plots against American bridges, for instance, dating back to the mid-1990s.
We're looking at ships that could be used as a battering ram against a bridge or laden with explosives to detonate inside of a port.
Al-Qaeda's track record in the past is they would look at something and, if it didn't work or they couldn't figure it out, they didn't forget about it. They went back and they were fine, they learned their lessons, and they tried it again.
And as they try to anticipate the next attack, officials know that Al-Qaeda is not limited to attacking with its own navy. Coming up next, when counterterrorism measures backfire.
It's basically electronic shopping for the maritime terrorists.
It's not just the ships that make up Al-Qaeda's navy that pose a threat. Experts worry that the sailors who man the freighters could also hijack another, larger vessel and use it for an attack. That possibility exponentially expands the terror threat against the U.S. and its allies.
The entire world is open to them. They just have to identify the particular boat for their purposes.
They can place crew members on board a ship. They can coerce a captain.
Security analysts say that hijackers could get control of a ship that everyone trusts and no one checks.
If you're going to use a vessel for an attack, you're going to use the rental car. You're not going to use your own fleet.
If they want to come after Europe, the United States, mainland, a major attack, and they want to use a ship to do it, They're going to use a ship that is shining clean, with all the papers signed, everything, all the T's are going to be crossed, all the I's are dotted. It's a perfect ship, not an old rusty freighter.
There are some 120,000 commercial vessels of all kinds plying the seas. For the commandos of Al-Qaeda's Navy, just sinking a ship in the right place could wreak havoc.
And I think the ultimate goal is for them to actually scuttle one of those ships and sink it into a key choke point because of how that affects the U.S. economy, how it affects the global economy.
The Houston shipping channel is a very narrow channel that if a ship were sunk in it, there would be no oil tankers being able to come in to offload that fuel with huge disruption to our energy.
Or the commandos of Al-Qaeda's Navy could turn a hijacked ship into an enormous bomb.
You have massive quantities of ammonium nitrate and dangerous chemicals, hazardous materials that are transported daily in these ports. And you have a group that really prides itself on being able to take everyday materials and develop dangerous explosives.
One could imagine scenarios where the ship could be blown up and therefore cause a lot of destruction, like an airliner used on 9/11 as effectively a missile against the Twin Towers in the Pentagon. A similar kind of scenario could happen with a ship, but a much bigger scale.
In 1947, the U.S. saw just how much damage a ship could do when one filled with ammonium nitrate caught fire and exploded in the port of Texas City. It was an accident, not an act of war, but nearly 600 people were killed, most of them on shore. Even an oil tanker could do spectacular damage, and there are thousands of them moving in and out of U.S. ports.
Another scenario possibly is to use an oil tanker transiting Florida Straits, that's below Miami, and maybe they overpower the crew and drive that tanker into the port of Miami and into the container piers there and have a good conflagration, a big fire and explosion, and that would bring that port to all stop for many weeks as they clean up and try to contain the damage and assess what needs to be done to prevent that from happening again.
Experts say that the idea of hijacking a ship is not as far-fetched as it may sound. In fact, there are modern-day pirates who do it all the time.
There is this other kind of piracy, this new kind of piracy, and that's close to a form of terrorism. It's not political like terrorism is, but it uses the same methods.
The tactics of piracy, boarding, ramming, attacking vessels, isolating vessels and boarding, and confiscating the materials are all being used.
Pirates usually take the ships to sell them and their cargoes, but there's not a big difference between that and taking over a ship to use for terrorism.
Certainly seeing the capability for that develop within piracy gangs, and those lines are blurring quickly.
It is reported that there are links between these two closely related cousins, and because they are cousins, there's no reason to think that that wouldn't be true.
Potential hijacking targets are limitless.
With hundreds of thousands of vessels worldwide moving around, at some point, if they do their homework right, and so far it appears that that's what they are very good at, they're going to find a vessel that's probably underinsured, with a short crew, that doesn't have any kind of protection.
And some experts say that the technology that's now required for ship security could make the terrorists' job easier.
AIS, the automatic identification system that is a transponder giving information with regard to the location, direction of travel, the items on board a ship, etc., has been criticized by some as providing aid and assistance to pirates and terrorists potentially, because now there's a signal coming from that vessel providing its exact location, its speed, where it's going, where it's coming from, and what's on board. It's basically electronic shopping for the maritime terrorist.
Al-Qaeda terrorists already know how to man a ship.
One of the ancillary benefits of having a Navy like that is the amount of experience that you gain. You have access to training, to actual work on board ships that could be used by persons that later might involve themselves in a terrorist act.
In addition, Al-Qaeda terrorists may be trying to upgrade their skills by qualifying for seamen's licenses, which would allow them to man a ship's helm. The licenses would also allow them to enter any port in the world without a visa. Even without a license, it would not be difficult for members of Al-Qaeda's Navy to sign on to another boat's crew. No one really knows who's working on most merchant ships, not even the owners.
companies, in efforts to keep their overhead costs down, will go to third world countries or underdeveloped nations and try to recruit people to work on their ships.
It's tremendously difficult for the shipping community to ensure that the people that they're hiring are who they claim to be, particularly since so many of the crew come from the developing world.
Many of the crew members come from Muslim countries where Al-Qaeda has sympathizers as well as members. And they often don't have valid paperwork.
If you want to know why, not only why we cannot track the identities of sailors today, but why we will not be able to verify the quality, political quality, of those sailors in the future, no matter what our technology is that they're coming from countries where identities are bought and sold. You don't have forged documents, you have real documents, okay? It's easy to get.
On a ship called the Sarah in 2002, the captain found that he had 15 people aboard who weren't really seamen. He radioed Italian officials to report them.
These guys are not sailors, they're throwing up, clearly they're not seamen. They're also being quite belligerent with my crew, and they were able to take those people into detention.
Officials said the men carried tens of thousands of dollars and documents tying them to known Al-Qaeda operatives in Europe. The Sarah was owned by a company called Nova, registered in Delaware and Romania. Another Nova ship also carried suspected terrorists. Officials have now placed the company ships on watch lists of suspicious vessels. But keeping track of suspicious ships can be next to impossible.
The ocean is enormously big. I mean, you can take all the continents of the world and put them inside the Atlantic Ocean. There are real physical limits defined by the horizon, defined by storms, defined by the multitude of ships that are out there.
There is no system by which we monitor where a ship is and where it's going. We take their word for it. They tell us when they've left and where they're going. If they decide to change the route, there isn't a mechanism to verify this. You know, we have satellites and so forth here, but there's a lot of ocean. And satellites can't just look everywhere at once. You just overwhelm the system with information.
So even though the U.S. and its allies pledged to board suspect ships in the wake of 9/11, so far they've come up empty-handed.
Random inspections of ships have proved to be unsuccessful because there are a lot of ships in the world and almost all of them are transporting legitimate goods. You've got to find that little point of a political problem, a terrorist or a terrorist tool, a bomb of something, buried in this enormous world supply of goods. It's very difficult to do.
What's even more frightening is that the men of Al-Qaeda's Navy don't even need to use a ship to attack U.S. ports. 9 million of them come through U.S. ports every year. They look harmless, but looks can be deceiving.
We have every possible bad thing happen in boxes. The bad guys know how open the system is.
The threat posed by Al-Qaeda's Navy may be incalculable. But the frightening truth is that Al-Qaeda doesn't even have to use its ships or its operatives to carry out a devastating terrorist attack in the maritime arena. The deadliest weapons at its disposal may be shipping containers.
A container can be used to deliver a weapon of mass destruction or any other kind of weapon, with great accuracy. It comes in by ship, among mountains of containers, millions that come in every year, basically uninspectable, and gets on either a truck or a train and is delivered to your address. With pinpoint accuracy, a weapon can be delivered through a ship, via ship, through a port, to anywhere in the United States or Europe or anywhere else in the world.
One reason containers have become such a popular mode of shipping goods to any destination is that they are very cost-effective and anyone can order a container.
For about $3,000 you can get one, fill it to the top, have it closed, put a 50-cent seal on it, and it's off to the races.
There are approximately 9 million containers, each filled with 32 tons of material that enter U.S. ports every year. In many cases, there is no telling what is inside.
There are a certain large percentage of containers that arrive in any country that you simply have to have faith that what's contained within them is what's listed on the manifest.
it's estimated that only 5% of containers that pass through international ports are inspected.
So we're talking about a system where 95% of the goods are assumed to be low risk and a wave through. The bad guys know who the low risk players are. They can find a way to infiltrate those shipments. They're going to know that they should set up a brand new company. They should go after a Walmart shipment, a GM shipment, a Sony shipment, something got a big brand name on it, precisely because they can expect it to be wave through.
But because time is money in the shipping business, efforts to step up container inspections have met resistance from ship owners.
There's been a tremendous pressure to make security essentially sit on the sidelines. Physically to do it, it takes on average 5 agents 3 hours to check a single container thoroughly. Because this is like going into a moving truck, take all the stuff out. That's what we're talking about in terms of weight.
We simply cannot screen every container. And if we tried to, we would have ships backed up all the way to Europe and Japan.
Nevertheless, there have already been examples of potential terrorists using containers to ship themselves to possible targets.
We had the Italian authorities back in October, after September the 11th, who intercepted and found someone who was apparently an Al-Qaeda operative, who was an Egyptian, inside a container, a seagoing container. He had a cell phone, he had a bed in there, he had an airline mechanic certificate.
The mysterious passenger, Ahmed Farid Rizik, known to some as Container Bob, was released on bail by an Italian court a month after his arrest and promptly vanished. In March 2004, terrorists were able to use a container with more lethal results.
Palestinians hid in a hidden compartment in what was thought to be an empty container and bought it in the port of Ashdod in Israel. They broke out of that container even though it was checked to verify it was empty because the inspectors didn't see that there was a false bulkhead.
Once off the ship, the Palestinians blew themselves up as they headed toward a chemical plant inside the port. 11 Israelis were killed in the attack, and 18 more were wounded.
What was unique and worrisome about this event, in my view, was one, the transportation system was being exploited for this terrorist act, and secondly, they were going after the transportation infrastructure as critical infrastructure as their target.
If terrorists managed to smuggle a weapon of mass destruction in a container into a U.S. port, the consequences would be catastrophic.
It would also be extremely devastating to the whole global trading system that is dependent upon the movement of goods and cargo by cargo containers, these 40-foot containers. And why is that? Because if we don't have a good and adequate security system in place, and that should happen, the system will stop. It's like commercial aviation after September the 11th. The system will stop.
New regulations that went into effect July 1st, 2004 are supposed to improve maritime security to prevent such an attack. For example, any ship headed toward a U.S. port now must give a 96-hour notice of arrival.
In this notification, a ship has to provide a great deal of information with respect to who's on board, what sort of cargo is being carried, where they've been, and the last 10 ports prior to the last port that they've visited.
If one of those ports doesn't comply with international security standards, the ship could be denied landing rights in the U.S. Ships that do come into U.S. ports are also assigned numbers that serve as their permanent IDs.
And that number has to be applied to both sides of the hull, aft of the ship, and also readable from the air, from helicopters and aircraft, for example, so that a nation state would be able to immediately determine who owns and who operates that particular vessel. Because in the past, you simply provided a name to the vessel, and you might have a dozen vessels plying the world seas with the very same name.
In addition to the new regulations, new technology is being tested to detect any sign of radiation from containers in an effort to prevent nuclear devices from being smuggled in by Al-Qaeda terrorists.
Like this one here.
One invention is called the nuclear car wash.
You have to imagine 2 walls of detectors, and these walls have a bunch of tubes of detector material, and the cargo container would be towed down between these 2 walls, and that's why I think of the car wash picture.
The scanning process takes a minute, and has a 95% success rate in detecting even small amounts of radiation. Experts agree, however, that the best way to deter dangerous cargo is to carry out inspections at the container's port of origin.
And for that, I need to be able to set up scanning systems at those ports with people that I trust to run them. And that probably means having U.S. citizens, probably employees of the federal government, stationed at foreign ports, doing scanning on containers that are headed our way.
Another device under discussion is the so-called smart container. Each one would be equipped with something similar to the black box on an airplane, recording its travels and monitoring its cargo.
Putting all these technologies together into a single black box is probably going to cost between $300 to $500 per container. But that container is used 5 times a year, and that container's life typically is 10 years. So that cost actually turns out to be in the $10 to $20 per shipment range, which is something that's certainly not going to shut down the global economy.
Despite the new regulations, better technology, and increased vigilance, the fact is, one container in the hands of a trained terrorist from Al-Qaeda's Navy could be disastrous.
It would be irresponsible to say that we are not vulnerable to a potential attack using any of the millions of containers that make their way into the United States in any given year.
And as U.S. ports scramble to find new ways to defend themselves against Al-Qaeda's Navy, the question is, will it be enough? For Al-Qaeda's Navy, the shipping industry has a bullseye on it, and U.S. ports may be the chief target.
It is an open door to a modern terrorist, a Tier 1 paramilitary planner like a bin Laden.
There are more than 300 seaports in the United States, and over 100 of them are capable of handling large ships. The 60,000 ocean-going vessels that anchor in the U.S. each year are the critical engine that helps drive the country's economy.
We need this maritime industry for about 90% of all the goods that come into the United States by volume. About $1 trillion of goods each year come into the United States by sea.
Ports have historically been easily accessible, making them tempting targets for terrorists from Al-Qaeda's Navy.
When we look at the vulnerability of ports to a terrorist attack, one thing that we sometimes overlook is the fact that they're frequently proximate to large urban centers like the city of Miami, where you have millions of people that are going to be victims to whatever assault might take place against the port.
In response, ports are now spending millions of dollars to comply with the new security regulations. The Port of Miami, considered a national model, saw its budget for security infrastructure zoom from $9 million just prior to 9/11 to $56 million in 2004. Preventing terrorism is now the #1 priority at the Port of Miami.
And it has moved our security plans to start to look at access control and restrictions as they relate to this issue of terrorism, which is an issue of national defense. It's a different level. We've had to redesign our security operations and plans to accommodate that terrorist threat.
In addition to new fencing, security cameras, and gamma-ray scanning units for potential nuclear devices, there are major construction projects underway to more effectively control the movement of vehicles in and out of the most sensitive areas.
You look at a port like Miami, where you have a confluence of recreational vessels, fishing boats, cargo ships, naval vessels, passenger ships. Protecting them completely is virtually impossible. So we're always going to live with the measure of risk.
Because private contractors conduct much of the port's business, ports are now requiring an ID badge that's issued to every employee.
We have a 7-year criminal background check that individuals have to go through to get a credential. This credential also has a chip in it that we use for tracking the companies that they work for on the port. And those companies have to have a permit, which they need to make an application so we know who's on the port.
Defending the ports and the 95,000 miles of U.S. coastline from the threat posed by Al-Qaeda's Navy is the U.S. Coast Guard. It faces an enormous challenge.
A ship can be either a target or it can be a weapon. A vessel such as a tank vessel carrying a hazardous material could be a weapon of mass effect. It could be used to plow into a bridge abutment or into a pier where there are facilities.
The Coast Guard coordinates intelligence for all the agencies involved in port security, including Customs, INS, the FBI, and local police, at joint command centers in major ports like San Diego.
Through all these sensors that we've integrated, we're able to develop a common picture of what is happening on the water. We are able to improve the flow of information that allows us to act on that awareness.
The aim is to push back the horizon, to stop any possible attack by Al-Qaeda's Navy as far from shore as possible. To support this effort, the Coast Guard formed a Sea Marshals unit with the authority to board ships 12 miles out. A ship with a questionable intelligence profile will have its crew and cargo scrutinized.
We determine the status of the vessel by sweeping certain areas of the ship. Then we maintain positive control of that vessel from the time we clear it to the time it gets to its final destination.
And since explosives coming into port present the greatest concern, there are K-9 teams assigned to sniff them out on land and at sea.
We also have a tactical law enforcement team in the San Diego area to put armed boarding parties on vessels, and they operate from Coast Guard vessels, naval vessels, as well as a new capability for vertical insertion by our 860 helicopters.
We need to have a strong Coast Guard whose presence is not only in the ports, but whose presence goes out at a minimum 1,000 miles off of our shores so they can find and reach out and touch any potential bad guy coming to us.
And with vessels often passing within a few feet of each other inside the open environment of ports, security analysts worry that another ship could fall victim to the same fate as the USS Cole.
You could have such an attack against a cruise ship leaving the port of Miami and going alongside it and detonating itself and perhaps sinking that ship. It would kill quite a few people.
The cruise ship is a very difficult thing to secure. The passengers, of course, can be checked to a point, but cruise ships work by visiting lots of places and letting people off and letting them back on in a hurry. They also require a lot of resources to make that mini city work, so people have a good time. The food that's being loaded on, the cargo that's being loaded on, the personnel who are providing the steward services. A very difficult thing to police under the compressed time schedule that cruise ships operate under.
But in Miami, cruise lines are working closely with the Coast Guard and local police to keep a safe perimeter around the ships, both above and below the water. Because security agencies learned shortly after 9/11 that terrorists might resort to underwater explosives, Miami-Dade police dive teams inspect every ship along with the docks and seawalls.
Although we had done diving in the past on cruise ships and freighters, we felt it was important to go out and do regular inspections, regular dives. We do it quite often throughout the week whenever the ships are in port.
Special sonar equipment hooked up to a computer can detect the smallest movement of individuals underwater and pick up anything out of the ordinary on the hull of a ship.
For several years, we've known that drug smuggling enterprises in Central and South America have actually used divers to spot weld blisters, half-dome metal covers, onto the hulls of ships that contain drugs that will later be removed in some foreign port. Obviously, if that works for drugs, it could potentially work with explosives.
Law enforcement has constantly had to devise new strategies to thwart this kind of terrorist activity. But terrorists are also watching and plotting inventive ways to avoid detection of any future attack.
The thing we have to remember is this is a war. A war has two sides. It's a competition between living, breathing, thinking enemies. And so it's always going to be a game of action and counteraction.
It's a complicated world we're in, and it's a world where we need to build safeguards into systems we depend upon. And the maritime area is one that screams to us that it's vulnerable, and also offers us opportunities, if we're willing to seize them, to make the world a safer place as well as an open and productive place.
Yet despite the stepped-up maritime security, the question remains. Will the new defenses be enough to stop an attack from the cunning and determined members of Al-Qaeda's Navy?